Well, hello everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I should say I figured out today the secret of how to make sure you have a successful talk, which is that you bring half of your research, or your entire research crew with you. So I should say there's a whole bunch of people here who have been part of this work, and as we go through, I'll do some shout outs to different pieces that different people have worked on. I am going to talk about the emerging problem of unregulated work, talk a little bit about where the research currently stands, some initial thinking about causes, and then sort of a broad overview of policy solutions. And you know, I say this as somebody who straddles the sort of research world and the public policy world. The National Employment Law Project is a policy think tank, and Think and Do Tank. We're a bunch of researchers and lawyers who work with community groups across the country to try to restore standards in the American workplace. And so I both do this kind of academic labor market research, but I also work very deeply in public policy campaigns. During the dark years of Bush, it was all at the local and state level, but now it's at the national level. And you know, my focus on unregulated work really has come from that work. I've long studied low-wage labor markets, but this focus on the unregulated part of the economy has really come from working with community groups and immigrant worker rights groups, and seeing the warning signals emerge of this growing problem. And then I should say, a lot of what you're going to see here is not just obviously my thinking from my research, it's from the collective work of a lot of the folks in this room and also other researchers. So this is sort of a combined hybrid set of thoughts. And then the other thing is people should just ask questions, you know, or interrupt, please, anytime. So let me start with the problem. I'm putting in some quotes here from some research in New York City. There were some compelling quotes we had. So, you know, in a nutshell, at a 30,000-foot level, this is a pretty straightforward story. We're seeing on the ground increasingly that employment and labor laws are being systematically violated. These are the core employment and labor laws that structure the labor market in this country. So minimum wage, overtime, health and safety, workers' comp, discrimination, and right to organize. We're seeing it primarily at this point still in low-wage industries, a broad swath of low-wage industries. I think that a lot of our instincts are that this is a growing way of doing business. So we're not just focusing here on, you know, incidental instances of these types of practices, but it's really something at the industry level that's starting to be a business strategy. And I'll talk a little bit about how I think one of the things at stake here is that these practices are starting to ratchet up in the labor market. But the impact primarily right now still is on low-wage and immigrant workers. And then the other sort of theme is, you know, there are economic explanations here, but you can clearly see the hand of public policy in this problem. So it's both been part of the problem, and we would argue part of the solution. So, you know, so at a 30,000-foot level, that looks pretty straightforward. It starts to get a little thorny when you get into definitions. And there's tons of terms around. People talk about the informal economy. People talk about unregulated work, precarious employment, informal jobs. Our definition of unregulated work here is really running everything through the lens of employment and labor law. So we include two types of jobs that are legally covered by employment and labor laws, but where employers routinely violate one or more of those laws. So this is really the straightforward scenario of there's a dishwasher in a restaurant. Clearly, that dishwasher is an employee of the owner. The owner is not paying minimum wage. Very straightforward. The worker is covered. The employer is violating one of the core laws. This second category is something that grew out of our field work. And it's jobs that are not legally covered by employment and labor laws, but where, you know, as a sociologist or as an economist, there is effectively an employment relationship, and the conditions of work definitely look unregulated. And increasingly, I think now, and even looking ahead into the 21st century, I think you're going to see a lot more action in this category. A good example is yellow cab drivers in New York City, who are independent contractors. The law would not treat them as workers. You know, under our current test, they really would end up being independent contractors. But the institutions that shape working conditions in that industry clearly make it look like there's an employment relationship. The Taxi and Limousine Commission sets fares, it sets lease rates. The garages that the workers work with really drive the employment relationship and how much money taxi drivers can make. So we would argue that is one example. Another one is publicly subsidized child care workers. There increasingly are workers who are falling outside our legal coverage, but where they really are effectively in an employment relationship. And we include those in our definition as well. Okay, so just like I said, to tease us apart a little bit more, this is a very complicated area in terms of the different concepts that people have. People talk about non-standard work and sometimes conflate that with what we're talking about. Non-standard work is where the structure of the employment relationship deviates from standard, like contingent work, temp work, etc. Sometimes there's a tendency to conflate those, that if you're a temp worker, you automatically are in an unregulated employment relationship, but I'll show in a minute that that's not necessarily the case. People have talked about informal work, and there's a reason why we didn't use that term, because informal work has often been used to talk about people who are really completely in the underground economy, who work in very peripheral establishments. And then there's the concept of the informal economy, which is meant to capture that there's a distinct market of trading goods and services that are produced in illegal conditions by illegal enterprises. So I know this gets a little confusing, so the reason I wanted to throw this out is I spent 2 days in Boston in the fall with a whole bunch of researchers from a lot of different countries who work on various versions of these things. And we literally spent like 10 hours a day for 2 days trying to get clarity on who's talking about what here. And I think, you know, we made 1 inch of progress. It was unbelievable. I mean, and everybody was, you know, there's 30 people, and we just kept talking in circles and circles and circles. What I got from that, though, is some clarity about the different dimensions that are going on here. And so this is sort of my current thinking about what we're talking about here, which is that basically there's 3 dimensions here that people keep conflating. There's the standard work versus non-standard work, and that's how work is organized. Within both categories, you can have regulated and unregulated work. Even in standard work, you know, somebody who's a direct employee, who has a full-time job, who's had that job for 10 years, they can have workplace violations. They can effectively be in an unregulated employment relationship. Examples here are Walmart workers, you know, who are working off the clock or not getting overtime. This is definitely standardly organized work, but they're in an unregulated relationship. Non-standard work, again, is contingent, temp work, etc. And here you can have people either unregulated or unregulated. And there's lots of non-standard workers in non-standard jobs who are in very regulated working conditions. So those are the first 2 dimensions, standard versus non-standard, and then whether they're unregulated or regulated. And any of those can fall either in the formal or the informal economy. And that's one of the big distinctions here, because people often conflate the economy story here with the sort of job story. But the economy is really about thinking about things at the level of the enterprise, and whether the enterprise itself is in the formal sector or informal sector. So anyway, one thing I had thought about doing on the plane was trying to fill in some of these cells with examples. But at least conceptually, to me, this has really helped me to sort through the different concepts that people have. And obviously, there's strong correlations. There's a strong correlation between non-standard work and workplace violations. And there's a strong correlation with being in the informal economy and having a non-standard type of job and being unregulated. You know, this is sort of the cell where everyone's screwed, right? The bottom right-hand corner. But they're not the same. And you can always find examples where the correlation is not 100%. And I think conceptually, we need to start doing this kind of teasing apart as we try to identify causes. What are some of the drivers of this phenomenon? So, in terms of the evidence on unregulated work, it's very hard to get at. You know, workers often don't know what kind of employment relationship they're in. Employers are not eager to tell you if they're violating the law. Our standard government data sets often don't measure this part of the labor market. So I think where we're at this point is we're in a young field, and most of the time what we're doing is triangulating between lots of different data points. We have very few representative employer surveys that measure the extent to which employers are violating employment and labor laws. The only ones that are really any good are ones that come from the end of the Clinton administration, where the DOL did actually went into workplace, random samples of workplaces, and measured employer compliance with employment and labor laws. There's only one representative worker survey that I know to date, and that was done by Nick Theodore and his colleagues of day laborers. That came out last year, or the year before.
3 years ago. We're getting older.
Years ago. There's one in the works that I'll talk about in a second. There's increasingly a good number of convenience samples of workers where worker centers themselves are collaborating with institutions like NELP and like IRLE to do, to interview maybe 500 workers in an industry and measure their working conditions. Those have been really invaluable. The worker centers have access to workers that, the government surveys don't, but they're unrepresentative, and we don't have a good sense of whether the prevalence rates are strong. There's administrative data, which I think is a really promising area, but is underused. The place folks have used this is to get at the misclassification of independent contractors. And there's a way to use state UI wage record data to come up with actually really good estimates of the extent to which workers are being misclassified. Most of the evidence comes from qualitative research on unregulated work. And a lot of folks in the room here have done this, and other folks in sociology and industrial relations. So that's really where most of the balance is. And then I always put this in because I do think that there are some indirect indicators here that we have to use, again, when we're triangulating. Deunionization, industry restructuring, declining enforcement, all of these things are sort of, pointers saying that something is going on in the labor market, and we should be talking about these and marshaling them when we're telling this story. So let me give you a couple of quick slides that are the result from one piece of qualitative research that I did with James DeFilippis and Siobhan McGrath, which is called Unregulated Work in the Global City, which consisted of 3 years of very intensive qualitative research in 13 industries in New York City, with more than 300 interviews with workers, employers, and regulatory agencies. And here are some of the key workplace violations that we identified. And again, these sort of run the gamut of if you take a tour of America's system of employment and labor laws, at every one of those nodes of protections, we found that there are violations, and employers are figuring out how to violate them. So it's hard not to think this way, but sometimes when you do these interviews, you really get the sense that employers literally sat there and said, okay, let me do an inventory of all of the ways that I can try to extract unpaid labor or reduce labor costs on any one of these pieces of employment and labor law. One of the things we found that probably not surprisingly is violations tend to come in bundles. When it's sort of like when you cross the threshold into violating the law, then you're more likely to do more of it. So minimum wage and OSHA violations, for example, go together often, and the same thing is the same principle is at work. And a lot of this stuff, though, is very industry specific, and I'll talk about that more right now, which is very quickly, if you want to analyze what's going on or where the solutions lie, you have to think in terms of industries. many of these practices are very specific. There's the form they take, who they impact, how prevalent they are very specific to the story about a given industry, how it's evolved over the last 30 years, where the economic pressures are, what strategies employers are resorting to cut labor costs. So this is a tour of the 13 industries that we found in New York City. If we had done this in other cities, we would add other industries here. We would probably add the hotel industry, which in New York City is so highly unionized that it really doesn't qualify as an unregulated sector. But in other cities would. You would have port workers. If you go into more rural areas, you would have the chicken processing plants. So this is the list of specific industries, again, is very specific to certain regions. In terms of the workers impacted, I think most people have this sort of stereotype. It's all undocumented workers. They're the ones who get impacted. In fact, they're causing it because they're willing to take lower wages. And it is absolutely the case that the workforce is heavily immigrant that is impacted by these violations. But we also saw a lot of US-born workers. Basically, I think the story is one, the workers who get impacted are the ones who are vulnerable and who have structural barriers to escaping these types of jobs. And yes, part of that can be that you don't have legal documentation. It can be that you're US born, but you have a criminal record, and nobody will hire you. It can be that you are on welfare and you're coming off of welfare and you don't have a work history, and so you have to put up with these conditions. In some sectors, like home health care, child care, it's largely US born workers. So there's not a simple immigrant worker story here. I can talk a little bit more about this later. We're just starting to sort of unpack the labor market dynamics here. There's very strong industry and occupation-based segmentation, which is probably not a surprise to folks. Certain groups tend to be in certain industries and jobs. There's surprisingly long industry tenure, which really, we were talking about this in the project this morning. People do tend to change jobs a lot, like employer to employer, but they tend to stay in their industry, which is amazing. They're working for less than minimum wage, but they're very, when you talk to workers, they're like, yeah, I'm a restaurant worker, and I love the restaurant industry, and this is where my skills lie. This is where I made my career. So, in fact, in a lot of ways, these workers look a lot like workers in the rest of the labor market. They enter the labor market, they churn through jobs, they slowly settle in over time, they become a certain type of worker, restaurant worker, construction worker. It's just that they're doing so in much worse conditions than in the regular labor market. Okay. I'm not a fan of this slide anymore, but I used to be. I don't think this way anymore. Maybe I should just skip it. But initially, when we were starting to think about this problem, we were trying to sort through the different strategies that we were seeing. And one way to categorize them is, what the employer is doing with the worker when they're breaking the law. And one way to think about it is employers increasingly trying to push workers outside the reach and grasp of employment and labor laws. So in-house externalization to us was just a way of talking about, in some cases the workers who are being violated are right in the establishment itself, like the dishwasher. And they're working alongside workers who are getting paid the minimum wage. So you see both unregulated and regulated jobs. Subcontracting, though, really helps to try to create a legal distance between the employer and the worker. You can still have workers working on site, but they can be working for a contractor. And if you're the main employer, you can try to wash your hands and say, oh, somebody else employs that worker, even though they're conducting the work on site. You can subcontract for work off-site, like industrial laundries are a great example. Hospitals and hotels used to do a lot of laundry on site, and now it's largely outsourced to industrial laundry companies, and they're the ones that do the violating. But you can try to say, this is so far removed from me, I'm not legally liable. Misclassifying workers as independent contractors is sort of the ultimate strategy, because when somebody's an independent contractor, they're not covered by any worker protections. And then I put in trafficking and forced labor, which is sort of the ultimate way of creating legal distance, because there's no pretense anymore that somebody is your employee, and you're getting into really severe human rights abuses. We did not set out to study trafficking in forced labor, but we really stumbled upon it, especially in the domestic work industry and in the restaurant industry. And it's definitely the most extreme form, a pole of the unregulated work problem. Okay. But I think, I don't know. I think there's another way to organize employer strategies that may end up being better than this. Okay, so in terms of evidence, just a last slide on the evidence. Like I said, I think for some time we're still going to be triangulating between different data points. But I wanted to give you a quick peek of the 2008 Unregulated Work Survey, which was just conducted by at least half the people in this room. And Ruth Milkman was heading up the LA piece via the center. I'm not sure, as part of the center's work. Nick Theodore was heading up the Chicago piece through the Center on Urban Economic Development. NELP headed up the New York City piece. And then we were working with statisticians at Cornell University. So it's a survey of more than 4,000 workers in New York City, Chicago, and LA. The survey could be as long as an hour and a half. We asked workers very detailed questions about the hours they worked, the wages they got, their working conditions. We used respondent-driven sampling, which I can talk about later if folks are interested, in order to allow us to get at these hidden populations of workers that the U.S. Census would not get. And we're very excited about it. The survey yielded representative samples of workers in those 3 cities. These are the 3 largest urban labor markets. We sampled on low-wage industries across the economy. So it's a very broad-reaching survey. And the first wave of results are due out in Labor Day. And we will be thrilled to regale you with another talk at that time. We're very excited about it. Any questions so far? No. Okay. All right, explanations. So this, by the way, is probably my favorite quote of all time, and I think this is the quote that describes what has happened to the U.S. labor market over the last 30 years. Not just in terms of unregulated work, but in general. That single quote describes a lot of what's happened in terms of the unraveling of wage standards and working standards in the U.S. labor market. So explanations. So I divide the world into, there's a set of explanations about economic drivers, and then there's a set of explanations about policy enablers. So there's no doubt that part of the story here is, it is about the last 30 years, changes that have started in the mid-70s, and it is about partly what is happening on the demand side of the labor market at the industry level. Everybody says globalization caused everything. Well, globalization has caused some things. There are some industries that we look at where clearly it's been the story is that global competition has put extreme pressure on the U.S. Wage floor, and therefore you're seeing employers resort to unregulated work strategies. What I would say immediately is that I think this is a very small part of the story. Most of the industries that you find these dynamics in are domestic industries where competition is still regional or national, where jobs are not footloose. The hotel worker has to clean the hotel on site. We haven't figured out a way to outsource that yet. The child care worker has to take care of the child on site. So I think people tend to say globalization, but in fact, I would challenge us both at the research level and at the policy level to understand that most of it, in fact, is about domestic economic trends, and therefore trends that are very much things that we can touch and we can try to change. So for a lot of domestic industries, we've seen just as much increase in economic competition as we've seen in global industries. The increase in competition in the retail industry now compared to the 1960s is insane. It's over the top. It's been driven by very strong economic restructuring, the advent of Walmart, really putting pressure on working conditions. And you can tell that story, those kinds of stories, industry after industry. Another dynamic that's played a huge role here is the growing number of industries that have gone public, and where the impact of Wall Street now, again, compared to 30 years ago, in terms of really pressuring employers for, you know, quarterly returns. You're only as good as your last quarter. I think we have really underestimated in the research literature. I think it has played an absolutely huge role. And when you talk to managers in a lot of the big industries that are now, you know, there's been a lot of industry consolidation. They're part of big multinational companies. They will talk about that pressure, which is not to excuse employers, but it's to try to identify where some of these pressures are coming from. Semi-public industries, this is something that we, I think, stumbled upon and didn't expect. There's a huge role here being played by privatization and by what used to be public functions and being pushed out away from government. And home health care and child care are the two poster children here, where those jobs are increasingly either being, they're paid for with public monies, so they're semi-public, but the employers of record are agencies or are private actors, and you, either those direct employees show workplace violations, or there's an entire gray market of unregulated work that has formed around those functions. And I can talk about that a little more if folks are interested. And then there's this vicious cycle dynamic, which is that unregulated work breeds unregulated work. So if you're working for $3 an hour, you have to be able to buy cheap goods and services. Who's going to produce those, give you those cheap goods and services? It's going to be establishments that themselves hire unregulated workers in order to give you the cheap goods and services. Ethnic retail is an example here. You know, the dollar van system in New York City, where you know, it's a much cheaper alternative to transportation that's being used largely by very poor workers. The guys who are driving those vans are themselves making less than the minimum wage. And I would not underestimate the size of this. I think this is, especially in big urban labor markets, this sort of sub-economy of unregulated production, I think is a key explanation here. Okay. So, even though those look like pretty huge drivers and sort of unstoppable Mack trucks, in fact, I think all of us collectively who studied this problem would say that the hand of public policy here has been very heavy, either in terms of public policy directly enabling these trends, or government, you know, I call it the great retreat of government intervention in all things economic over the last 30 years. Government just stepping back and not intervening as this story was unfolding. The first way that you can see that hand was in the declining enforcement of workplace regulations. I'll show you a slide in a minute, but you know, we do have these very strong laws in the books, and the government is supposed to enforce them. And you know, if you don't enforce things, then people will violate them, right? Compliance is a function of the strength of laws and then the strength of enforcement and the probability of the strength of enforcement and the probability of being caught. And on both fronts, there's been declining enforcement of workplace regulations over time compared to the 60s and 70s. But beyond that, I think that the inadequate and declining workplace standards has played a big role here. The minimum wage now is 30 to 40% lower than it was in 1968. And I think that that has had an impact here in terms of enabling these types of strategies. Because what it means is that subcontractors can come in and bid for a contract at much lower wages than you might be willing to pay internally. You might be sort of an upstanding, you know, Goldman Sachs, but now I want to outsource and this is a true example, I want to outsource my janitorial work. I'm not willing internally to pay those janitors, you know, $6 an hour. But look, because the minimum wage is so low, and because there's somebody out there who can violate it, I'm going to subcontract out to the lower wage and sometimes unregulated subcontractors. So I think this has actually played a big role in terms of enabling this. I think if the minimum wage had kept pace with where it should be, which would put it at, you know, $10 or $11 an hour now, we wouldn't have as much of a problem as we do. And there's other examples of this. OSHA regulations were largely written in the 1970s and have not been updated or upgraded, and in industries where health and safety problems are really severe, you know, advocates will talk about the fact that the standards themselves have elicited violations of those standards. And then finally, dysfunctional immigration policy, I think, has played a huge role. I mean, I think even moderates would say at this point, our policy is completely broken. It is effectively disenfranchising millions of immigrants in the workplace. If you do not have status, you cannot fight back against these conditions. You can't try to file, or you're scared to file a claim with the Department of Labor. There's no doubt that this plays a role, and people point in particular to 1986 and IRCA, the Immigration Reform Control Act, which you know, effectively made lack of papers illegal in the workplace, and it really gave employers a very strong stick to yield over workers. So those are three places where you've seen the hand of public policy, and I promised to show this. Just you can see the declining enforcement in the numbers. We FOIA'd the Department of Labor during the Bush years, and amazingly enough, the first time around they gave us data, and then after that they ignored all my FOIA requests. But the first time around I got good data. From 1975 to 2004, the number of investigators that were dedicated to ensuring compliance of minimum wage and overtime laws declined by 14%. The number of compliance actions by the DOL declined by 36%. The number of covered workers increased 55%, and the number of covered work sites increased 112%. So declining enforcement in absolute terms in the face of a rapidly expanding labor market. And if we looked at the growth in low-wage workers, this would be an even higher arrow up. So that's a complete failure of public policy, a withdrawal of regulation at exactly the same time that more regulation is needed. Okay. So then let me just quickly talk about solutions. And I should say on this, NELP has a lot of, this is now putting on the policy hat, we have a lot of resources on the solutions front, and we're working very actively with immigrant worker centers and other advocates now at the national level with the new day and the new administration, and I'm still drinking the Kool-Aid, to try to make the federal DOL a real force for change. To try to change some of the old, outmoded workplace laws. So you should know that there's a huge amount of energy right now of taking some of the experimentation of the last 10 years at the state and local level up to the federal level. This stuff gets really geeky and detailed pretty quickly, so I try to put just very general principles up, but I can talk for hours if you want about some details on what's needed, sort of mirroring the failure, the places where public policy failed over the last 30 years. Here are the places where we can really leverage public policy and government intervention. One is, of course, better enforcement. I mean, we have to turn the tide of that graph and flip it upside down, and reacquaint the Department of Labor with its actual mission, which is to protect American workers. Protect all workers. It's a very big distinction.
Well, we're flipping the job growth part upside down.
Oh, well, no, okay. Right, so let's get to enforcement. Right, this is the time. We have fewer jobs, let's do it now. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen under here. The sort of big headliner is we have to get to proactive enforcement. Right now, regulatory agencies are largely passive, and they wait for people to come with their complaints. They don't go out there, they don't do proactive, aggressive enforcement. During the end of the Clinton years, actually, they started doing that, and you can really see the impact when an agency turns the corner and decides, I'm going to go out, I'm going to do random compliance sweeps, I'm really going to announce over the airwaves through my actions that it's no longer fine to violate employment and labor laws. And New York State is really a poster child for this. With Spitzer brought in an incredible head of the New York State Department of Labor, who has done an amazing turnaround over the last 2.5 years in improving enforcement in the city and state. And the good news is that she's now the head solicitor for the national, well, she's been nominated, and we think she'll be confirmed for the National U.S. Department of Labor, and we'll bring a lot of that experience to bear. We definitely have to increase penalties. It's absolutely nuts. If you're an employer, you do the calculation. In many cases, it comes out that you're much better off just violating the law. The cost of getting caught violating the minimum wage law in most states, you'll pay at most twice of the wages that you robbed the worker of, which is not a lot in the end because these are very low wage workers. There's no reason why that should be the ceiling on penalties. You know, there should be really strong penalties here to really try and deter employers. And we need significantly better anti-retaliation protections, especially for immigrant workers. Because often that's where it also sort of falls apart, when the employer just goes after the worker who's trying to complain. Anyway, there's a bunch of other stuff that falls under here. But like I said, we also need to strengthen our standards, and we have to bring back up to speed our employment and labor law standards, like the minimum wage, like OSHA, and of course labor law reform. To try to bring up the floor at the same time that you're doing a better job of enforcing it. And then this is where I think a lot of the challenge will be over the next century, which is increasing the reach of workplace regulation. We are seeing growing numbers of workers in employment relationships that currently are not being caught by our legal system. Our legal system is still, I think, dialed back 30 to 40 years in terms of the employment relationship that it contemplates. We have not updated our legal tools for getting at workers in subcontracted establishments, for example. And there's a variety of things, and this starts getting very legal, and I'm not a lawyer, so there's a big disclaimer here. But this is really going to be the challenge. How do we make our worker protections fit our new employment relationships? And then finally, we need equal status for all workers in the workplace, and this is specifically about comprehensive immigration reform. And I put status in there because I think, rather than protections, because I think this is going to be the real challenge in comprehensive immigration reform. You can write strong worker protections into immigration law, and in fact there are some places where workers are well protected, but it's not translating into actual equal status in the workplace. And the place where the rubber hits the road on that, of course, is talking about guest worker programs. And can you have guest workers who may have all the legal protections that you want to put into law? Will they get those protections and an equal status in the workplace? And it's really a question about, is there such a thing as separate but equal? And you can see my bias. I don't think there is. I think the lesson is that the minute that you create separate categories of workers, you automatically lose the equal status. But that's an open question, and I would just flag that it's really the guest worker debates that are trying to confront that. And then you have to have a very strong firewall between enforcement of immigration and labor laws, and that's one thing that we used to have in this country, but has increasingly fallen by the wayside, especially under Bush. And this is, again, not an easy one to pull off. It really means that you do not have communication between the Department of Labor when it enforces minimum wage laws and ICE. And even if the Department of Labor knows that they have an undocumented worker, that they cannot call ICE or cannot alert the immigration authorities they have an undocumented worker. This used to be sort of the gospel for people trying to do cases on the ground, but we've seen, especially during the last year of Bush, that this really fell apart, and you saw the two agencies basically inform each other. Okay, and then the last piece, though, is that it can't just be public policy, and as much we can get the DOLs to do their job well, we can strengthen our standards and our laws, but the reality is that there's never going to be enough resources on the government end to pull off really reining in this problem. In New York State, there are 500,000 workplaces roughly, and the New York State Department of Labor has 110 investigators, right? So even if we double that, and not all those 500,000 are low wage low-wage establishments, but still, it is just physically impossible for OSHA or the DOL to have enough people to, every year, for example, monitor every single low-wage workplace. So we need to figure out other ways to leverage power and pressure here. In particular, we need worker centers and unions to organize low-wage workers and get real density in some of these industries. And I stress the density part because, I think there's healthy organizing going on, but I think the lesson from unions is that until you get a significant portion, you organize a significant portion of an industry, you don't really have power. And for worker centers in particular, I think this is one of the big challenges, is how do you get enough power over an entire industry. We need the private bar to help bring strategic litigation. I'm not an expert on this, but my employer friends have really convinced me that lawyers used to be totally allergic to wage and hour laws because wage and hour cases because they couldn't make enough money off of them. I think you're starting to see people take more, at least class action cases, but this can be a really strong tool. If you go into an industry and you really go after a high-profile employer with overtime suits or the discrimination area is sort of the poster child here, you can really start to bring in some of these practices. This one, you need to figure out how to bring responsible employers on board. This is the one that I'm fascinated with about whether it's something that we can do. I was in our field work, I was very struck by that the employers who weren't, we interviewed employers who were violating workplace laws and ones who weren't, and the ones who weren't would talk candidly about how these practices put pressure on them. Very clearly, they would say, these guys are undercutting me. I'm trying to pay $9 an hour. But that was a high wage in the industry we were interviewing in. I'm trying to pay $9 an hour, but I can't make my books because other people are paying the equivalent of $5.50 an hour. But you can't. It's been very hard to get these guys to come out publicly on this stuff, and people have tried. Rock, New York, which was one of the premier worker centers in New York City, has an employer roundtable that we've helped to organize, and where their goal is to sort of divide and conquer and bring the responsible employers on board. And you can get some of the responsible employers to come to the roundtable and to talk about ways to try and improve the industry. You cannot get them to go public. And so I think that's something we have to try and figure out. The cases
Class solidarity.
Right, class solidarity.
If only we had it.
We have it, right. They have it, we're trying desperately to get it. It's interesting because we work on a bunch of campaigns where unions are able to sort of bring their employers out, like living wage campaigns or minimum wage campaigns. Unions are great at bringing out their signatories who will really go public and say, raise the minimum wage is a good thing, living wage law is a good thing. But, this makes me realize they're strong-arming those guys to the pulpit. And what if you don't have that kind of leverage? How do you get them on board? And then finally, we need to integrate unregulated work into the broader progressive agenda. And, this is really a social movement question. I think, the issue is starting to get more play. Worker centers, are starting to get a lot of play. There's still a lot of balkanization. And we really need to see these issues get onto the mainstream, Center for American Progress, Democrats' agenda, and it's not. Even there's still great divisions, not divisions, but there's not a lot of communication or collaborative campaigns between the living wage movement and the worker center movement. That would be my first place where I would say we need to start joining. We can't be advocating, trying to pass minimum wage laws and not be talking about enforcement. We should be doing those at exactly the same time. NELP has been helping to try to do some of this. We advise a lot of minimum wage campaigns, and when we draft minimum wage legislation, we actually put in very strong enforcement provisions as well. And San Francisco is a great case where San Francisco has its own citywide minimum wage law. And some of the worker centers then started bringing cases using these strong enforcement provisions after the law was passed. So that was one of those great marriages of the two sides. But we need much more work on here. And I think the worker center movement itself is starting to really think strategically about who to make alliances with and common cause with to try to knit this issue into the broader progressive agenda. So anyway, I'm going to stop there, and then we can see if people have any questions about any of this. This is some of the resources that I'm basing this on. This is the book that Chris talked about, which is a great book. You should totally buy it. This is a report that I wrote with James and Siobhan at the Brennan Center. This is a memo for that conference I talked about where everybody was trying to get the concept straight, where that sort of grid thing came from. And this is NELP's sort of Obama blueprint that features prominently the types of reforms to the DOL that I was sort of flagging folks are working on. Great.
Okay. Question?
Are either ACORN or that, I'm not quite sure about the acronym, SABU, big union for hotel workers, etc., involved in some aspect of advising or representing low-wage immigrant workers, either in an advisory capacity or in representing them?
That's a good question. I mean, ACORN has more traditionally worked on living wage and minimum wage campaigns, but I know depending on the city, this is all about, you know, locals, you know, and regions. In some cities, ACORN is really starting to make common cause with worker centers and work jointly on campaigns. I mean, ACORN is not a union, right? It doesn't represent workers in workplace disputes. But at the level of policy campaigns, you know, passing progressive legislation, ACORN is starting to really come on board. And that's really where the worker center movement is actually starting to move a lot, is thinking about public policy campaigns, actual legislation that you can pass. And then the second one was HERE, the hotel workers union? Or?
It starts with an S, I believe.
Or CIU, I think you mean. Is that possible?
In the news recently because of presidential malfeasance or something.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's a bunch of different unions. There's SEIU, which is the General Service Workers Union, and then there's HERE, which is the service workers, yeah. You know, they're definitely, the service worker unions in general, whether it's in home health care, whether it's in hotels, whether it's in the grocery store industry, you know, all of their new organizing, you know, is largely immigrant workers. And in places where they're able to get real density, I think that this is one of the things that unions deliver. I think it's one of the less well-known things. People tend to think that unions deliver, the main thing they deliver is the wage standards and the health insurance and the working conditions. But the other thing that unions have historically delivered is really good enforcement of these basic workplace laws.
I was referring more to the problem you said about the immigrant workers being afraid to make claims about not being given a proper minimum wage.
Right.
Conditions. I wonder if anybody was representing them.
They
on
are.
the ground.
That's the immigrant worker centers, right? Do you know? Are you familiar with that whole new movement? You should. There's a couple of great books on them. It's precisely because unions were not historically organizing in a lot of these industries that immigrant worker centers have cropped up over the last 10 to 15 years. And they started actually, most of them started exactly like you said. They were centers where people were giving individual workers help and bringing claims. That has since turned into a movement of actually organizing workers most innovatively at the industry level. So Rock, New York is a restaurant opportunity center of New York. That's a worker center, it's not a union, and they're organizing a largely non-unionized industry. And you can go industry by industries, and many of them there are worker centers who are starting to do that. I think the real big question is, can we begin to see campaigns where the worker center movement is working with labor on some of these initiatives? Because labor still has relatively more power in terms of passing legislation.
A couple of the slides you mentioned discrimination law or under enforcement and so on. But typically, at the federal level, the EEOC does it and not labor, and at the state level, different agencies typically do it. I wondered the extent to which you think, or how you think that race and gender discrimination in particular continue to play a role in these processes you're describing, and then also whether this work looks at the enforcement, under enforcement of discrimination laws.
That's a good question. Yeah, you know, on the latter, it's true, we have focused less on the discrimination, the enforcement of discrimination law. And so I'm less, I mean, I don't totally feel comfortable about making statements about trends and enforcement on that front. I think in terms of causes and drivers, I think that's an incredibly important question. To date, I think in a lot of this literature, I think we've sort of said, and yes, there's discrimination, but we're really focused on this sort of the workplace laws dimension, you know, minimum wage and overtime, and we tend to approach the problem through the lens of labor. But I was just thinking about this the other day, I'm increasingly feeling like we really have to grapple more directly with how much of this is also the result of direct discrimination. It is striking how strong, for example, the gender segmentation is in this sector. I think it's stronger than in the sort of regulated economy. And I don't think that's just that women like to do, you know, home care work more than men. I think there's clearly a gender story here. And I think there's a race story, but the race story gets very, very complicated. The interaction of race and immigration status is, I think, something that we haven't conceptually, as analysts, you know, as researchers, really figured out. But I've been hearing increasingly people talk about the civil rights, approaching this world through the lens of civil rights, and starting to actually name the fact that especially Latino workers, you know, in addition to these sort of employment and labor law violations, are probably very likely subject to discrimination as well. You know, I think the Southern Poverty Law Center just released a report showing a significant increase in hate crimes on the basis of race against Latinos. So I think it absolutely operates, you know, the question of when you talk to employers, and Chris, you know, is one of the leading authorities on this, but when you talk to employers about their preferences in this part of the labor market for which type of worker, it is absolutely unbelievable. And employers have the most like fine-grained systems of sorting. This is not just immigrant versus black, which is, you know, of course, what a lot of researchers are interested in. This is like, you know, recent immigrant women from, you know, the X region of India, you know, make the best X, Y, and Z. Whereas for this type of job, you know, I prefer, you know, people from South America, you know, from a certain region because, you know, they have nimble fingers or something. I mean, it's unbelievable. And so I think even what race means now from the perspective of employers has gotten much more complicated.
Well, most of these laws also affect national origin and color and would get to those things if they were enforced.
Yes. Yeah?
I like unions and worker centers as, oh, is there something behind you?
No, yeah, go ahead.
I like unions and worker centers as much as the next guy, but in the foreseeable future, there's not going to be huge amounts of density in most industries. And so I'm just wondering whatever happened to the idea of works councils. It sort of surfaced during the Clinton years, the discussion of having sort of a required committee in workplaces over a certain size for occupational safety and health, and then people sort of elaborated on it and got put in legislation a couple of times and never got passed. And I just think, you know, given that the best way to have something enforced is to have somebody on the ground keeping an eye on things, what about that idea? Do you see people taking it up again, or do you think it's a good idea?
I haven't heard anybody talk about it in years, you know, like at the policy level. I mean, it just even hasn't, I haven't heard about it at all since like the late 90s, it was, right?
Yeah, that's when right.
Right, yeah, so no, I haven't heard it come up at all. I'm not sure what I think about it. There's a research project that I was involved in studying the hotel industry in the U.S. and comparing it to 5 countries. You know about this.
Yeah.
You did the other industry. Anyway, we compared it to 5 other European countries, several of which had works councils or, you know, otherwise named. And we were focusing in particular on the violations piece. And in the hotel sector, those councils were not, were really powerless, and it was really a function of the lack of union power in an industry. Like in Germany, for example, I mean, the unions in the hotel sector are totally weak and don't control the bottom of the labor market anymore. And you see a lot of what they call black work, but you know, undocumented workers and workplace violations. And so my German colleague would argue that worker councils, works councils are just a structure. And the question is, where's the power? And if unions don't have the power anymore in an industry, those structures become hollow. And in fact, that's what you see in the hotel industry. So, but I don't have a strong horse in this. I don't think I understand it well enough to know if that's a viable enforcement system. But I was struck in that case by, you know, we look longingly at that system over here, but it's really become completely, basically powerless and defunct, at least in that industry. Anyway. Yes, sir?
As one of the few outsiders in the room, your talk was outstanding. I'm very, very impressed. All of you contributed. One thing I would mention in this nation, which is a very sore point with everyone in business, is the taxation policy. It's your priorities are great. Later on, it will be gradually phased in, where every employee, from small to large, is required when they outsource work to have an addendum to the report they get to the IRS, with each outsourcer required to supply to the employer, to the buyer of the end, some listing of the people who are members. Might be 50, 100, 200 people, but fine. They have hundreds of customers, they can supply the list. The government concurrently should give, again, this will be phased in over 10 years, would give some sort of economic bonus to it. Anyone under like $10 an hour, the government would not demand that they pay the same amount of Social Security tax to the government Social Security. They give them an economic fillip for that. The second thing in taxation is to tax larger families, to get rid of the poor who grow up in a poor family, generating large poor families who are used to doing with no work, that past 2 children, you shouldn't have this lower economic status populating itself over and over and over again. Taxation could be where we right now encourage large families through taxation. We should discourage. Now again, nothing to do with your priorities, which would certainly make much more sense than what I'm saying. But eventually, if this is added in over 10 years, you might have some population control. You might have the outsourcing as a requirement of every IRS submission. And hey, the IRS hasn't got a few hundred people. They could have a few 100,000 people. They've been emasculated over the last 30 years. But they're the only money-making group in the government. Every time you hire one, that person pays for itself. And that's maybe one long-term way of getting help.
Yeah, I don't know, and I'm not an expert in taxation policy at all, and thinking through all the various incentives and disincentives and way to use taxation to try to achieve social goals. So I'm really brain dead on this. You know, the only thing I would say especially on the family taxation front, in terms of the outsourcing piece, you know, I'm not convinced that even though subcontracting and outsourcing to some extent are the most evident signs that you can see that something has changed in how employers produce things and may enable more violations and lower wages. I'm not convinced that just trying to rein those in will solve our problems. I think we've got a fundamental problem, which is that at the normative and legal and statutory level, we have withdrawn from trying to protect workers in the workplace, whether they are direct employees, whether they're employees of subcontracted workers. And until we solve that central problem, I'm not sure that trying to go after just some of the strategies themselves is enough. And frankly, I think that horse has left the barn. And, you know, I think the janitorial industry is actually a good example where subcontracting does not have to be evil. And, you know, janitors are now almost wholly supplied by the janitorial services industry, and nobody really has internal janitors anymore. Well, SEIU has done, you know, a fabulous job of figuring out how to organize that industry. It's an entire new industry. It didn't used to exist. It's the same with food services or the industrial laundry sector. These are new industries that have grown up over the last 30 years. And part of me says, let's make our laws, our enforcement tools fit the new realities of how things are produced. Rather than always trying to put, you know, the genie back in the box. So that would be my instinct, is to try to figure out how do we get at these brand new industries and raise the standards, rather than trying to figure out how to use incentives to get employers to withdraw from these strategies. But maybe that's putting up too strong an either or. I think you can probably try and do both. Anyway.
Yeah, labor economics is not really my field, but this may be a little bit naive question. But have any of the crafts or teaching unions, for example, kind of joined with the idea of trying to improve the work of unregulated workers, non-standard work? Do they see this area that is a problem as part of some of the things that they should be focusing on? Why don't you kind of regard to that?
Yeah, no, I think the good news on that is they're starting to. I think there was a point where it was definitely the case that unions were not actively trying to organize many of these sectors, or the bottom of these sectors. And that's why you saw the Immigrant Worker Center movement grow up. I think now increasingly unions are recognizing that if standards are being eroded in this part of my industry, that makes it much harder for me to renew my contracts and to organize workers in sort of the more formal part of the labor market, and I need to start worrying about this part of the industry. I think the challenge for unions is I am having a hard time even organizing the big guys in my industry. I can't even sit, now I'm going to try to think about, you know, the gazillions of tiny shops that are undermining standards in the industry. And so I think, you know, in both the AFL and the SEIU, there's a real recognition we have to start working with the worker centers. And we may not be able to commit resources to organizing that part of the labor market, but we want to leverage some of our power to help the worker centers organize that part of the labor market. And the smartest versions are ones where they're actually talking about organizing a sector together. So this has been part of the excitement of the last 5 to 10 years, where you're seeing actual formal alliances being created between unions and some of the worker centers. You know, in New York City, the place I know best, the Central Labor Council, just got, you know, an awesome, amazing new head, and he brings with him a passion for having the Central Labor Council really leverage its power in support of the worker centers in the city council, and has already done so on a couple of cases. So I think it's more a question of, it's more a scenario of collaboration and having unions leverage some of their powers for worker centers. We don't have many examples, if any, yet of actual joint organizing, I think, except for one or two.
What about the one of the teachers union working with Acorn for subsidized childcare workers? Subsidized childcare workers in New York are defined, as Annette said, as independent contractors, but through a collaborative organizing effort, or at least now able to have to bargain collectively, and have reached an agreement with the state government that they can, you know, even though they're not employees, but they can collectively bargain. And that was absolutely the teachers union that you mentioned was a central part of that. Sorry.
There's a sort of a long-standing discussion in the realm of social insurance, like Social Security and things of this type, that sort of what gives the political force behind things like Social Security is that it's not a means-tested thing. So it applies to everybody, and sort of a lot of that's sort of the New Deal-ish sort of programs and things that were added onto it, like Medicare and so on, sort of have a lot of political force behind them because they cut a broad sweep of the population. Now, in a certain sense, if you focus on, you can see the sort of some of these things going on at much higher wage occupations, like independent contracting. It's not illegal not to provide health insurance or to go from defined benefit to defined contribution. So these are not employers who are violating a law, but nonetheless, sort of the labor conditions tend to erode under the same sort of pressures that are evident here. But if we just focus on the bottom and say, well, I'm going to really work on minimum wage workers, in the larger structure of the labor market, there aren't a lot of minimum wage workers. There really aren't. I mean, you've got numbers on it, and you can argue with whether they're picking up this or that, but you're talking about well under 10% of the workforce is anywhere near the minimum wage. So if you focus on that, you don't get the sort of the political side of it. The health insurance, that's why Obama I didn't hear him talk a lot about the minimum wage, but I did hear him talk a lot about health insurance, which is a sort of this larger thing. So I'm just wondering whether sort of kind of a narrow track on these sorts of issues is going to develop a lot of sort of political force behind it.
Right. No, I absolutely agree with you, and that's why I had sort of at the end that we have to get this issue folded into the larger progressive agenda. And one of the things I was going to geek out on a little bit, but then decided to skip is, and this is where the Gloves Off Economy volume that Chris and I edited with Laura and Heather, there's a big decision, even at the conceptual definitional level, to focus just on the employment and labor laws, or to broaden out and also include what we call in our volume the normative standards. So running alongside the violation of the employment and labor laws, there has been very much employers evading or violating normative standards of employer-provided health insurance, defined pension benefit plans of the full-time job, of annual wage increases, etc. And in the Gloves Off Economy volume, in the introduction, we fold those together. And we package them together as this is the big, starting in the 1970s, this is the big emerging set of strategies. And I always try and talk about those together when we do any type of policy work, because I think many of the drivers are exactly the same things. And in some cases, employers are violating normative standards, in some cases legal standards, in some cases both. And you're right, I think politically it helps us ratchet it up to a level where you can get, the much sought after middle class vote to get excited about your issue. Anyway, that gets into a political analysis. I'm not entirely sold that that's the way to do it. I do believe that the immigrant worker center movement and unions, that there's a point where you really need a very specific voice and constituency that is pushing really hard for, some of the changes really are ones that are just for the bottom of the labor market, and we have to have them. So I think it's both yes and no. I think, the minimum wage polls at 90%. It's the total apple pie issue. I know Obama's not talking about it right now, but you can, when we won all the state minimum wage increases, you can get everybody to buy into that. I think the question, can we get people to at least feel the same way about enforcing your core labor laws? I thought you were going to start out by saying this should be a home run because we're not asking anything except just that the laws that everybody protect everybody, and that regardless of which industry you work in or how much money you make, you should at the very least be able to get minimum wage overtime and so on. So I do think that we do need to do some public education to get them to understand how much of this is about the core standards in the U.S. and that it can ratchet up. And I think the independent contractor issue is the one place where you've seen it, where you're starting to see coalitions of highly paid independent contractor workers getting behind the same types of legislative fixes. So I think it's both and. I'm not sold that if we just bundle it well enough with healthcare reform, we'll get what we need, but that definitely is a necessary ingredient.
And if you just take recent events, I think you could probably get a lot of people upset about what happened. We moved from defined benefit to defined contribution, and look what happened to my 401k. Now these are not workers who are worried about their 401ks here. But that is an issue that will grab a lot of people, and it's sort of percolating around now. Nobody knows exactly how you sort of grab onto that in some way, but it seems like that there's a kind of a lot of leverage in all of that.
But I would say the left has totally failed even to tell that story. I mean, this is all the same story, it's just different sets of strategies, but we haven't educated ourselves and the public about what's happened to pensions. And healthcare is only coming up. I think we haven't even well explained enough where the healthcare crisis has come from. I think everybody understands the healthcare crisis, but I don't think we've told our version of it well enough. I mean, I think collectively, I think the left has failed to tell the story about what's happened to workers over the past 30 years, whether it's in some of these more broadly shared protections or on the legal protections. But I agree with you, we need to tell the integrated story. I just think we haven't done it yet, or not well enough yet.
Yeah, I want to go back to labor enforcement for a second. I know in New York, I think it's Make the World by Walking is doing this new project, and we talked about something similar here in Los Angeles with labor officials about really utilizing. I mean, these worker centers are struggling financially now for many reasons, you know, and there's a way to leverage government resources and maybe create official status of some of these organizers that can participate in some of the enforcement. You know, like deputizing some of these organizers to do limited labor enforcement. Because they can go much deeper than most labor officials. And I think they got a project on the way in New York. So I don't know how that project is going. I haven't kept in touch about it, but any thoughts about that?
No, I think that one's gone well. I mean, that's good. That's one of the key elements in any of the policy reforms is to try to get government funding for the community groups to help do this work. The only thing I would say is that it's been hard. This is going to take time. It's hard to get. It has been hard to get the New York State Department of Labor to feel comfortable working that closely with organizations that are advocacy organizations, community groups on the ground, and understandably so, they feel like they're going to get accused of playing favorites, you know, and of hunting down employers, and you know, giving money to radical organizations to try to shut down, you know, poor small businesses. So it has been it has gone slowly to begin to foster these collaborations. I think absolutely that's the gold standard. I mean, that is the only way you make an agency with small number of investigators and small numbers of investigative hours effective, is that there are community groups on the ground that are channeling those investigations.
I wonder if I can get Chloe to just react to this framework. Well, like a picture, Chloe, somebody who's actually working hands-on with, you know, immigrant workers in this kind of situation. So not to put you on the spot, but put you on the spot.
Well, I mean, I think we've, you know, Victor can attest to this too, we've definitely seen all of these problems in the car wash industry in Los Angeles, and, you know, we've filed Cal OSHA complaints and had workers fired, union workers have organized and they've been fired, and filed, you know, complaints with the labor commissioners and been fired. And so I think that's definitely, the retaliatory piece is definitely a big one. I was also curious to see whether you had run across in New York any research on how the labor agencies there are reacting to political pressure to produce numbers, right? So to have quantity versus quality in enforcement, and how that kind of corresponds to, you know, there's this limited set of resources that a labor agency has. There's, you know, political pressure to have numbers of investigations, of sweeps. And the new director of our campaign comes out of the Labor Commissioner's office and has been very critical of this shift in the past few years into, you know, high volume but low effectiveness. So you go in and you cite on the easy stuff. You cite on, you know, no registration in garment, car wash, and you cite on failure to carry workers' comp. But you don't have, you know, kind of these intensive investigations that turn up massive wage fraud. And so that you have what end up being, you know, relatively low penalties that aren't deterring employers, but are easier to collect on actually.
Yeah.
So whether you've seen that in New York and how the agencies there have kind of reacted.
That's interesting. I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is we should all be so lucky as to have this problem. Because the reality is, I mean, it's interesting. I don't think that the New York State DOL actually feels any pressure to produce numbers, just because we're still fighting our way out of, the Pataki years where we never made any numbers. So we should all be so lucky to get to the point where there's actually enough attention to DOL reform. And so it's interesting that you guys think that really exists in California. I think that's really interesting. That in and of itself, I think, is an interesting marker. I don't know that there's any other state where that's true.
I mean, the caveat to that might be that it may just be in certain industries. And maybe Victor can speak to this, but where this has come about, where there's been also intensive public pressure through, legislative battles, etc.
I think that a combination of labor push by labor groups and high-profile campaigns, like for the car wash campaign, the Labor Commissioner's Office in California never even considered the car wash industry at all. It was not only until advocates started getting out, the LA Times articles started coming out that they feel the pressure not to produce numbers.
Right. Right.
That kind of pressure.
Right.
The question I have though, I mean, speaking of
Let
agencies.
me just say one thing though. I mean, one version of this is, the crackdown on independent contractor misclassification, which, this is my little hobby horse. I think it's a problem, but I don't think it's the primary problem in this part of the labor market, but it gets so much attention. And that is the one place where you've seen multiple states really do stuff. And partly it's because, the building trades have been very focused on that in some of the affordable housing contracting. And so there's been a lot of, and maybe this is a version of what you're saying, and so there's been a lot of pressure on it, and it's sort of got that flavor of the moment. You can get people upset about it because, it costs taxpayers money. That's a kind of place where, I think it's it's one of the important ones. I think it probably is getting outsized attention and resources relative to some of the other violations that I think are more common or more widespread. But that's just another way of restating what you're saying is people will chase where the attention and where the pressure is. But I don't know how to get around. If we do get to the point where the U.S. DOL feels like real pressure that every year they have to make numbers, then I think advocates are going to have to figure out how to wean them off of the easy hits. Maybe part of it is coming up with better measures of what performance means. The Bush DOL in the last couple of years really hid behind the fact that they were able to show an increase in, I think it was wages recovered, but the only reason they were able to do that is they were going after some somewhat higher wage industries, so the net amount of wages were higher, but they weren't actually doing more compliance actions or impacting more workers. So maybe part of the answer is let's think about, in our ideal world, what are the measures that we want DOLs to adhere to?
One thing
Is there, sorry, there was, yeah, go ahead.
Follow up, I'm trying to push advocates to think more outside the box than just, the state labor laws and labor protections. It's the whole CBA movement, community benefits agreement model, and I think, every municipal government has these regulatory schemes that covers different employees in different ways, and and a lot of it doesn't have to do with labor standards, but it has to do with other kind of permits, regulations that a friendly political elected officials, a friendly city council can probably manipulate that process to force these employees. For example, the car wash industry, every car wash in Los Angeles has to get certification by the Department of Public Works for the underground storage tanks. So in that case, why not work with Public Works Commissioner to require them to conform to labor standards as part of the certification? So it goes beyond just labor laws, but look at other regulatory schemes that you could do on a local level, just analyzing each municipal government.
Yeah, or add labor law violations into every definition of responsible contracting, which is something that we're definitely trying to get at the national level. I think you're right, absolutely.
I was going to say, one thing you have to be careful of, as you just mentioned, keyword, the national level. If you do it on a state level, you'll end up like the credit card companies. They incorporated that in South Dakota and North Dakota, with their no limit on interest rates, and they got out of New York State, they got out of California and all that.
Right.
There's nothing to stop the car washes and the maid service and the hotels from hiring contractors who are in South Dakota and North Dakota who don't have California's restrictions and New York's restrictions. So your priority list is fabulous, but you have to be careful not to get it just on the state level. The
Yeah, no, and I think that's why we're all focused at the national level. We really need to get it across the board, totally. Yeah. Cool.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.